So I am back. Just wanted to say thank you to everyone in Wayfarers who was kind enough to kind of cover my usual responsibilities while I was in myself covering over at Gateway Presbyterian Church for the month of April. It's a huge privilege having a number of people who are invested enough in our community to be willing to teach and lead music and lead communion. Um, yeah, it's a gift to remember that we kind of leave this thing together as a community. So thanks everyone for covering and letting me step away. So the series I did over at Gateway was just kind of one of my favorite themes we see in the Bible, and that is God showing up in the wild places, God showing up in surprising, often dark circumstances. And so what I did was a series that I called Voices from the Wilderness, looking at just some of my favorite stories around this theme. So just kind of a quick reminder about this theme and the idea of wilderness. And I think that word has a very different connotation for many of us here in Colorado. I think of wilderness in a very positive light, right? It's those places that have been protected, that are not, we cannot develop, that cannot be owned. It's pristine wilderness, the chance to go out and be in our beautiful mountains and hopefully connect with God and see beauty and nature that's unspoiled. The connotation for people in the ancient world would have been very different. Remember, the people are still living in small villages at this point. The population of the world overall isn't as big. The places between those villages, the wilderness, maybe a better word for us would be like a wasteland or a desolate place. Are dangerous. They are places that if you don't know where water is, especially in the ancient Near East, this is a desert. If you don't know where water is, you don't know the safe paths, you could very literally die traveling from village to village. These are places that wild animals are still very much a problem, lions and other dangers. It's a place that, bandits and people that don't want to be part of villages and societies hang out, and so there's like violence and people preying on one another that way. And it is the place that, more than just the physical dangers, people associate with being the places of demons and monsters and the other out in the world that can harm us. And so the wilderness is not a place you want to be if you can avoid it. It's dangerous, and it's in many ways. And yet, this seems to be a place that God shows up again and again to surprise people, to teach people special things. So we'll look at some of those stories kind of for the month of May. So the first of those stories we are going to look at is this iconic story of Moses and the burning bush. So just some kind of quick background on where we are kind of in the plot of the Bible. God makes the world good in the beginning, and people, by our free choice, choose self-reliance. We choose to break this good world in our relationship with God, which is what we call sin. So God is not really deterred by this. God begins the process of starting to redeem the world, and he starts this by making promises to some certain individuals, what we call the patriarchs. He points out that he has a land and a place he wants to provide for them in, and he wants them to have a very special role and identity in the world, in that they can represent him to the rest of the world, show an alternative way of being in the world, show kind of who God is to the rest of the world, right? And so fast forward to the beginning of the book of Exodus, and these promises can be a little hard to understand in how they've actually played themselves out. So at the very end of Genesis, God's people, which were still kind of a large clan at this point, go down to the land of Egypt because of a drought and a famine. And then over the course of the next couple hundred years, they will become a huge group of people who will then be enslaved, forced to build pyramids and cities. They don't even live in this promised land that was supposed to be providing for them. They are oppressed, they're in slavery. They don't really even have an identity, let alone one that represents God to the world. The main character of this story is going to be Moses, who in many ways is similar. He is someone who is snatched from death at a time when they were killing all the firstborn. He's snatched through some kind of trickery by a woman who is going to raise him in the imperial palace itself. So he's raised as an Egyptian, but he rejects that identity. He sees and knows who his people are, we're told that he decides to kind of use the tools that he has learned being part of this empire. So he tries to use violence. He kills one of the taskmasters, probably hoping to inspire the rest of his people to rise up violently against the Egyptians, and it comes to nothing. And so rather than him being, this hero and this savior that starts this revolution, he's just a murderer, and he has to run away for his life. And when we catch up with Moses, we find him 40 years later. Moses has married, and apparently he's not even that successful as a shepherd. His new role in life, which was a very despised role, by the way, both to the Egyptians and many of the other people in the world. But he's not even very good at that, apparently, because even 40 years later, he doesn't have his own flocks. He's doing a job kind of made up for him by his father-in-law, right? And I don't know a lot of guys that will think of themselves as successful when the only job they can get is one that their father-in-law kind of made up for them. And so God's people are in a wilderness, not literally, but in a place that is difficult and of desolation, when there's really not a lot of hope. And Moses himself is in the literal wilderness, out in the middle of nowhere, no hope, no prospects, basically a total loser. And yet God breaks into this situation for both of them. So I'm going to read this famous story from Exodus chapter 3. Moses was taking care of the flock for his father-in-law Jethro, Midian's priest. He led his flock out to the edge of the desert, and he came to God's mountain called Horeb. The Lord's messenger appeared to him in a flame of fire in the middle of a bush. Moses saw that the bush was in flames, but that it didn't burn up, and Moses said to himself, "Let me check out this amazing sight and find out why the bush isn't burning up." When the Lord saw that he was coming to look, God called out to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "I'm here." Then the Lord said, "Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals, because you are standing on holy ground." He continued, "I am the God of your father, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, Jacob's God." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, "I've clearly seen my people oppressed in Egypt. I've heard their cry of injustice because of their slave masters. I know about their pain. I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians in order to take them out of that land and bring them to a good and broad place, a land that's full of milk and honey, a place where the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites live. Now the Israelites' cries of injustice have reached me. I've seen how much the Egyptians have oppressed them. So get going. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I'll be with you. And this will show you that I'm the one who sent you. After you bring the people out of Egypt, you will come back here and worship God on this mountain." So some just kind of things to note about this text. One interesting thing is this brand new word is used as God first speaks to Moses. He says, "Hey, take off your feet, or take off your sandals, because you're standing on holy ground." This is the first time in the Bible this word holy is used, which is obviously a word that has had a lot of thinking done about it. It's a very important word to the Bible overall. And this tradition of taking off your shoes in the presence of a place that is holy is a very interesting one, because Moses would have been familiar with this idea. In the day, the idea of holiness was that the gods were separate from people, right? That you had to be very careful in how you approach them, how you touch them, because they're bigger and more powerful than you, and because they're a little touchy about, us dirty mortals coming around. And so there are elaborate ceremonies in Egypt at the time. There are elaborate ceremonies in some of the other, like Babylonian and other. They have these temples where the gods are kept very far away from other people, where the average people can't. You have to be highly trained in how you approach the gods, because the places where the gods are holy, are set apart, are different, are goddish, are special in some ways, right? And so Moses would have been familiar with this tradition, because one of the big traditions you did in Egypt when you were going in to meet with the gods was you took off your shoes, because this place was special and it was theirs, right? It's also a tradition you did for the kings, the pharaohs, who were also considered divine. And so the weird thing about this passage is God is using language that Moses would have been familiar with, having grown up in Egypt, probably having been part of a lot of these rituals. But these are in highly elaborate, beautiful temples with rituals, with highly specialized priests around them. What on earth is a God doing out in the middle of the wilderness, in the desert, talking to a nobody like Moses? And this is going to be, I think, a really important theme for the book of Exodus overall, is teaching holiness is not God being far away. Holiness, God's presence, the places that are special because God is there, is wherever God is. It doesn't have to be up on a mountain. It doesn't have to be hidden away in a temple. It's wherever God is willing to have his presence be, that place is special because God's very presence makes it that way. And you don't have to be highly elaborate and highly specialized to do this. There is going to be some of that later in Exodus because, God doesn't want people to take his presence in too cavalier of a way. And yet Moses, a very undeserving, not priest, is perfectly capable of going into God's presence because God is choosing him, because God is reaching out to him. And this idea is such an important one. God's presence anywhere and in everything, even in the, filthy, terrifying wilderness, can be holy and special if God is willing to be there. So kind of moving on in the story, there's a couple of interesting things that God says. So in verse 6, he says, I'm the God of your father, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, Jacob's God. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And so, again, it's really interesting how God chooses to define himself, right? He does not define himself as, hey, I'm the God who made everything. Hey, I'm the most powerful of all the gods, although he will prove that point later in Exodus when he kind of lines up and knocks down all the other Egyptian gods, right, with the plagues or the signs that we see later in Exodus. But he defines himself by his friendships. He says, I'm the God of your fathers, right? I'm the God of Abraham and Isaac, Jacob. Again, all characters that aren't real impressive when we read the stories about them, but God binds himself to this group of people. And I suspect this means something special to Moses as well. Who does he even believe of himself as part of this tradition? Like, I grew up in Egyptian. I tried to rejoin my people and was rejected, and I've been living in Midian for the last 40 years. Like, does he even have an identity as one of God's people anymore? And God says, yeah, you do. You are still one of us. You're one of this special group of people, and I'm going to use you in unique and special ways. Again, God chooses to define himself by his friendships, not by his power, not by his glory, not even by his holiness, which we were just talking about. And following along kind of those same lines, this is not a God who's hidden away in a temple, who is far away, but he says, I have clearly seen my people oppressed in Egypt. I've heard their cry of injustice because of their slave masters. I know their pain, and I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians in order to take them out of the land and bring them to a broad and good land, a land that's filled with milk and honey. And so I guess the last line there is, I've seen how much the Egyptians are oppressing them. And so this line is so important. Again, God is not far away. God sees, God hears, God is willing to come and be among. God is willing to do something about the situation they find themselves in. This promise is reiterated. I know it feels like it's really far away. I know it feels like that this thing is never going to happen. And yet, I am the God who sees, who knows, and the God who is going to do something about this, the God who is near. And so God's presence, again, shows up as holiness, but it also shows up as action. You are going to know by the end of the story, I, as a God, not who is aloft in heaven, not who is so impressive by my very being, but a God who acts and who does. You're going to know me as the God who saves, who is the God of your people. So he's defining himself by relationship. In the book of Exodus, he's going to define himself as the God that is a savior, a God who does things. And so at the end of that, this incredible encounter ends in a way that, it'd be nice to feel encouraged by God and be like, okay, that's awesome, God. Like, you go do your thing and I'll sit here and wait and see what you can come up with, right? But this is not just for Moses' spiritual edification, just to encourage him. He says, great, so get going. Love that translation. So get going. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And Moses said to God, who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Right? And God's response in a lot of ways is, yeah, I know who you are. I'm God, right? I know you're a nobody. I know you're no one, but here's the difference. I'll go with you. I'll be with you, and this will show you I'm the one who sent you. After you bring the people out of Egypt, you'll come back here and worship God on this mountain. The sign doesn't feel like much proof, except he is offering, like, look, within history, there will be a point in time when you are back here again, and this thing has been done. You have to trust me in that. You have to see that. And yet, I'm sending you not because you're impressive. I'm sending you because you know who you are, and you know you need me. And I think God often sends people not who have all the answers. God does not send people who think that they are capable, can handle things. He tends to pick people like Moses and you and me, who aren't capable of the things that need doing in human history. And that, I think, is why God picks people like us. Rather than relying on our own strength, rather than relying on our own smart answers or whatever resources we have, God simply says, I'm sending you because you're someone who knows what you are, who knows that you need me, who knows that you need to rely on me. And I will do these things. You'll be part of it. I want you. I'm sending you. But you are part of these things because you know you need me. And ultimately, I'm the only one who has the strength to accomplish these things. And I'm the only one who's going to do that. And so it's interesting. One of the kind of reads I've heard people say on this is the symbol of the burning bush, right? We've got this common thorn bush that is there burning and yet is not consumed. And these thorn bushes would have been everywhere in this wilderness area, in this desert. They're common as can be. And yet this thorn bush is able to bear fire, a very common image for God, right? And so I think this image is a really beautiful one of how God often wants to work with us in these places of wilderness, whether it's the oppression that they're facing, whether it's Moses feeling utterly incapable of the things that are in front of him. He just says, I'm just a nobody. I'm an average thorn bush. There's nothing special about your people, right? And yet God's presence, this fire with light and heat and the strength, will continue to burn in this thorn bush that is the common, that is us, without consuming it. We, in many ways, get to be the thorn bush too. Yeah, we're prickly. Yeah, we're not that good of listening at God. And yet we can be a container in some ways. We can be a host, something that can carry light and fire and life to the world, like Moses did, like his deeply flawed people continue, and like God continues to do. And so I think the question is, for us, is looking at, okay, where are the places of wilderness, the places of desperation in the world? Is it within ourselves? Is it out in the needs of our neighbors, those around? What does it look like for us as well to be sent to bear God, even though we're nothing special? We're Moses is, we're thorn bushes, and yet God promises his presence. God promises that because he is there, it is special, and he is the fire, and it will be enough. It's a beautiful message, though it's also a kind of scary one at times. So that's my take on Moses and the burning bush, this first kind of voice from the wilderness.